Anne went home to think over all that she had heard. In one point, her feelings were relieved by this knowledge of Mr. Elliot. There was no longer anything of tenderness. I'm Ellen.
I'm Harriet.
And I'm Michael, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week, we're reading the published version of Chapter 22 of Persuasion. Harriet, let's start with your 100-word summary.
So even though it's only one chapter we're doing, I still had to cut back a bit to try and encapsulate it. Anne considers Mrs. Smith's revelations as she walks home and is cool with Mr. Elliot when he visits. She's pleased to hear he'll be away for a couple of days. The next morning, she plans to see Lady Russell, but Charles and Mary unexpectedly arrive. They're in Bath with Mrs. Musgrove and Henrietta, and Anne spends the morning with them at the White Hart, where Wentworth and Harville also call. Mary sees Mr. Elliot talking to Mrs. Clay, which surprises Anne. Charles and Mary argue about the theatre versus an evening at Camden Place, and Anne and Wentworth have a brief conversation. And Michael, your summary.
Okay, I'm astonished that you got all of that in, as I cut most of the things you talked about out of mine. So my 100-word summary. Anne is embarrassed by her father and sister's adoration of Mr. Elliot and is herself cool to him. Charles and Mary Musgrove arrive unexpectedly, having come to Bath with Mrs. Musgrove, Henrietta and Captain Harville. Anne returns with them to the White Hart, where the upcoming weddings of Henrietta to Charles Hayter and Louisa to Captain Benwick are discussed. Anne admires Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's support for their daughters. Charles returns with Captains Harville and Wentworth. Mary sees Mr. Elliot talking with Mrs. Clay to Anne's surprise. Sir Walter and Elizabeth arrive to invite the whole party, including Captain Wentworth, to their soiree.
Yeah, well, I think we did capture different bits, which is good. Though I noticed neither of us mentioned that the chapter finishes back at Camden Place that evening, and Mrs. Clay doesn't volunteer the information that she was talking to Mr. Elliot until Anne prompts her.
I had a version that attempted to include both the earlier and later Camden Place discussions and then had to take them out.
Yeah. So in the original version of Chapter 22, which we read last time, Anne doesn't even make it back to Camden Place before she gets hijacked by Admiral Croft, then meets Wentworth, and then everything is reconciled and resolved. But of course what we get instead is she reintroduces the opportunity to be funny about Charles and Mary. And I think just the extra time she spends in this chapter and then in chapter 23 on the Musgrove clan as a whole,
Yes.
and Captain Harville, and of course everything that happens in the next chapter, just makes it so much more a rich ending.
Yes.
And bringing everyone back into it is, well, almost everyone, not Louisa and Benwick.
Yes, she pulls them all
Yes.
back on the stage.
But it's not only the Musgrove clan, because it's also an opportunity to be funny about Sir Walter and Elizabeth.
Yeah, because we get much more Sir Walter and Elizabeth
Well,
in this
in a
version.
sense, she pulls all the characters back on the stage.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So in the council chapter, she bumps into Admiral Croft, but now she gets all the way home, thinking about Mr. Elliot on the way home and planning to tell Lady Russell as soon as she possibly can. And that's actually something I might mention now, because it comes up in this chapter and again in the next chapter, is we several times get this, she was going to see Lady Russell, but she had to put it off.
Yeah.
And something that one of the Talking About Jane Austen books speculates is whether, in fact, Jane Austen did, even when writing this, have an even more extended ending planned, with the fact that Lady Russell didn't get told immediately becoming important. But that sort of moves into that kind of external circumstances causing problems and confusions, which I think wouldn't have fitted as well.
Well, my feeling has always been that Jane Austen worked out that bringing Lady Russell into these last couple of chapters would add complication that she didn't need. And so she writes her out and then has to explain why she writes her out.
What I see is fairly interesting in this latter part of the book is how proactive Anne is and takes it on herself. It's her job to sort out the problem of Captain Wentworth being jealous of Mr. Elliot. You know, at one point she says, well, surely everything will come right. But in fact, she's very much taking it on herself that the reason it'll come right will be because she does something about it.
Yes, even if it's not overt, if she just sends him the right signals, which is why a bit later in the chapter, when she says that she believes Mr. Elliot is away, she's then kicking herself for this is making it sound to Wentworth like she's very aware of Mr. Elliot.
Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the highlights of these chapters is the way they demonstrate how Anne has changed from the beginning of the novel, from being a very passive character to being quietly very active.
Yes, or to use the words of that article I mentioned last time, as the book has progressed, Anne has gained her voice, and we see in these revised versions of the last two chapters that she's using her voice, whereas in the original version she's retreated back to being an overhearer, a listener, not a speaker. Whereas here, even though she's all tied up by the constraints of propriety and what you can and can't say, within those constraints she is saying everything she can to give the message to Wentworth.
Well, you get the impression that as soon as she realised that Captain Wentworth is still interested in her, she thinks, my job.
Yeah.
I've got to do something about this. And there are also all sorts of ways in which a woman can do this.
Yeah.
But they're not formulated.
Yeah.
They're just known.
Yeah.
But there is Anne very busy doing all the things a woman's supposed to do to tell a man, yes, come along, I'm interested.
So in terms of the events of the chapter, after Anne leaves Mrs. Smith, instead of being, as she was originally, waylaid by Admiral Croft, she makes it home, and we have an evening at Camden Place where you have Elizabeth being so affectedly, oh, I'm not at all interested in Mr. Elliot, I'm scarcely aware of him.
Yes.
And then Mr. Elliot rocking up and being so nice to everybody and being a little bit surprised that Anne is more cool to him than she was the day before.
Well, he thought he'd got something really nice going between him and Anne.
But again, I think this is also a good example of how his expectations have been based on the more passive Anne, who, whatever she was thinking, did not give off any signs to him of disinterest. And now he's confronted with this much more active Anne who's willing to more actively signal her opinion.
I would disagree with her being so passive with Mr. Elliot, because since she arrived in Bath, she's found him the only person she likes talking to, and she has talked to him, and they have engaged with each other quite actively. And the day before at the concert, she responded very, very positively to his hints about, oh, well, someone told me about you way before I met you. I don't think it is unreasonable of Mr. Elliot to have believed that Anne was interested in him, but I do think he's surprised that suddenly, from being quite engaged with him, she's now stepping right back.
Yes, that's probably a better way of putting it.
Yes. Another point is that point where she talks about Anne's shame at the mortification that's being prepared for Elizabeth and Sir Walter.
Yeah.
When they find out it's not going to be good.
Which is interesting in that it's showing her show empathy for people who have no empathy for her.
Yeah.
Even at this point, she's not giving up on them.
On the other hand, it is a bit the pride of the Elliots she's worried about there. The honour of the Elliots, I suppose she's thinking about.
Then, Friday morning, again, a scene that just brings Sir Walter and Elizabeth into the spotlight when Anne is about to go off to visit Lady Russell, and Elizabeth says, oh, you may as well take back that tiresome book and pretend I read it. And I thought she looked quite hideous the other night. I was ashamed of her at the concert, something so formal and arrangé in her hair, and she sits so upright. My best love, of course.
Yes, it's a very ugly stepsister, stepmother kind of
Yeah.
vibe.
So the next thing that happens is Anne doesn't get to go and see Lady Russell because Charles and Mary arrive. And I'm just so pleased that Charles and Mary arrive, and in these revised chapters we get more Charles and Mary. Sir Walter and Elizabeth put a decent face on it, but as soon as they know that Charles and Mary aren't actually planning to stay with them, they can suddenly be a lot more cordial.
It's such a wonderful vignette where you get the essence of both Sir Walter and Elizabeth and the Musgroves.
Yes.
On the other hand, putting oneself in Sir Walter and Elizabeth's shoes, it could be a bit disconcerting if you have close relatives unexpectedly turning up and saying, "Hi, we're in Bath, we'd like to stay with you."
Yes.
They do it themselves without batting an eye.
We also get such a typical story behind their arrival that Charles was going to come with Captain Harville because the shooting was over and he had nothing to do. Then Mary could not bear to be left because Mary can't bear to be left out of anything that's happening.
Not so much anything that's happening, but she can't bear Charles to be off doing stuff.
Yeah.
Except, presumably, walking up and down with a gun in his hand.
And from there we get the news that Henrietta and Charles Hayter are going to be getting married very soon because Charles has been applied to by a friend to hold a living for a youth who could not possibly claim it under many years. And so on the strength of his present income, with almost a certainty of something more permanent long before the term in question, the two families had consented to the young people's wishes. That fits in with all the stuff you've been saying in this season and in earlier seasons about clergymen and livings, and in this instance, the living is promised to a small child, presumably a younger son of the family, so they need someone to sit there until that child is old enough himself to take orders. We get the funny bit that Charles Musgrove thinks of this living Charles Hayter has in terms of it's got great shooting potential.
I love the picture. The really lovely thing is there it is, the three great properties on either side.
But of course, he won't care because he's not interested. Then again in this conversation between Anne and Charles, she asks about Louisa. And Charles seems like he's not really happy with the way Louisa, who used to be so sort of happy and carefree and bouncy, has now become that there is no running or jumping about, no laughing or dancing. It's quite different.
And the picture of the little dab chick.
Yeah, if one happens to only to shut the door a little hard, she starts and wriggles like a young dab chick in the water, and Benwick sits at her elbow reading verses or whispering to her all day long.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of this is she is actually still recovering from concussion.
I have thought that, and that she has been changed by the trauma.
Not by love.
It's adding a layer which I find interesting, really, that rather than just having the simplistic, she met a new person and is in love.
Yes.
It's an awareness that
it was a life-changing event.
Exactly.
I guess Jane Austen leaves it up to us to decide, is this personality change because of the fall, or is it because of adapting herself to what Benwick wants, or is it a combination of the two? And will, in fact, she get some of her spirits back as time goes by? And we don't know.
Yes, but in many ways it's reminiscent of Marianne and Colonel Brandon.
It kind of is.
I hadn't thought of that, yes. So both of them, it's a response to something physical.
I suppose the response to something physical then opens them up to a new type of love interest.
Yes, if one wants to see it positively, I suppose the haters will say that it's victims of PTSD
Yes.
Well, yes,
being taken advantage of.
Then Charles and Mary insist on taking Anne with them as they go back to the White Hart to meet up with Mrs. Musgrove and Henrietta, because basically they all want Anne to be there.
Yes.
And it's so nice that her presence is actually desired by people, not just by Mrs. Smith and Lady Russell.
Yes, I mean, it's really nice the way Mrs. Musgrove wants her, because she's not thinking, we want Anne to be here to do this for us or that for us.
No.
We're going to be having a nice time and we want Anne to share it. The thing that bothered me was you've got the Musgroves arriving at the White Hart, and within quite a short time, the room is full of all sorts of
Yes.
old friends. How did they know? Did they send a boy with a note around saying...
They probably did to all of their acquaintance in Bath, just a note to say, just letting you know we're here, feel free to drop in. I don't think they had time to write in advance. I think they must have, as you say, sent a boy with a note.
What I think is interesting is also that the style changes, that it becomes more active. When we move from Camden Place to the Musgroves, Not only the setting changes, but the writing changes.
Oh, and the pace.
Yes.
And particularly, possibly, I don't know if it is the length of the sentences, but something has definitely changed.
It's the length of the sentence. And as you were talking about, how more or less every paragraph, a new thing is happening.
Yes.
There's the great Mary scene where Mary sees Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay out of the window. Anne in particular doesn't believe her. When she says it cannot be Mr. Elliot, he was to leave Bath at 9 this morning. And then she realises that will make Captain Wentworth think she's very conscious of Mr. Elliot's coming and goings.
Yes, but that's also starting this unrealised bit that something is going on between Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay.
Yeah.
But we never quite get the backstory of that. At some point, I think it might be a bit later, where she thinks that Mr. Elliot is telling Mrs. Clay off.
But that's, I think, one of the cleverest aspects of this ending, that here are two characters that were being focused on quite a lot.
Yes.
But in different contexts. And because of the way the novel is written from the perspective of Anne, there's been no sign that this has been going on.
You get that in Emma as well, with Frank Churchill and
Yes, indeed.
Jane Fairfax. There are fewer clues this time.
Yes.
Just a couple of much more subtle ones that, again, only on a reread do you think, oh, that's a clue that there was stuff happening in the background, but it wasn't enough of a clue
Yes,
for you
exactly.
to see on the first read.
We've had misdirection here.
Yeah.
Because Anne assumes that he is somehow telling her off, whereas what we gather at the end is he is sort of flirting with her or courting her, and at some point in the future he makes her quite a nice offer.
The next thing that happens is Charles comes in and says, aren't I a good boy? I've got tickets for the play tomorrow night and we can all go and have a good time because the box holds 9 people.
Yeah.
And then you have Mary saying, but we can't. We're going to my father's house tomorrow night to meet the family connections. And so Charles and Mary have this dispute. Then there's the tiny conversation between Wentworth and Anne where he says, you used not to like cards, but you might have changed. And she says, I haven't changed that much. And then he says, I think it's the first time he's actually referring to the gap, that it is such a long time.
Well, which must be great for Anne, because this is her project.
Yes.
She has got to tell Captain Wentworth she's still interested.
And then Sir Walter and Elizabeth arrive, and it's like the temperature of the room just drops. They just put such a dampener on the room when they walk in, and then everything perks up again as soon as they walk out.
I think they would be so condescending that they would use the formality as a way of reinforcing we're better than you and you should be incredibly grateful that we are bestowing our
It could
our
also
attentions upon
be
you.
they walk in expecting this adulation and they get it. A version of what you were saying, the kind of greeting. They give a kind of greeting when they come in, to which the response is different from the response that they give when old Musgrove friends turn up.
Yes, so they would see it as being proper deference and everyone else is feeling,
How soon can they leave?
yes.
Yes.
Then in the evening, she's back at Camden Place, and she has to spend it listening to Elizabeth and Mrs. Clay making all the plans for the party. And that's where she's surprised that Mrs. Clay doesn't actually volunteer that she met Mr. Elliot in the morning until Anne asks her about it. I think that's the bit where she thinks that Mr. Elliot has been threatening Mrs. Clay.
Mrs. Clay calls Elizabeth Miss Elliot, but Elizabeth calls her Penelope, which is anyway the same pattern as we had with Emma and Harriet.
Well, Elizabeth is saying there is this social distance between me and my good friend Penelope.
Yes, or else that her good friend Penelope, she probably automatically says Miss Elliot, and Elizabeth accepts that.
Yeah. Elizabeth has never said, oh, do call me Lizzie.
No.
Yes, it's a bit like she's treating Mrs. Clay as her dog.
Yeah.
Well, as her unpaid paid companion.
Yes, which is about the same as the dog.
So, favourite sentences. Michael, why don't you start?
Okay, so I have chosen... It was a struggle between propriety and vanity, but vanity got the better, and then Elizabeth was happy again.
That's sort of the full Jane Austen wheat, isn't it?
Yes, and the full encapsulation of a character in one short sentence.
Yes. The one I've got is where Mary says, no, we must go to Camden Place to meet Mr. Elliot. And then this is the bit that Charles says that I think is so lovely. "Don't talk to me about heirs and representatives," cried Charles. "I am not one of those who neglect the reigning power to bow to the rising sun. If I would not go for the sake of your father, I should think it scandalous to go for the sake of his heir." I just think that's, again, really nice because it's sort of somehow the personality of Charles comes through, that he's not over-impressed by the Elliots. He sticks up for himself and he can be a bit funny.
To me, it seems that he's mocking their pomposity by phrasing it in a deliberately mock-pompous way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the one I've decided to go with, and I think I mentioned it earlier in the chapter, is Elizabeth saying to Anne about Lady Russell, "Oh, you may as well take back that tiresome book she would lend me and pretend I have read it through."
Isn't it just after that she says she is tired of all the
new poems and states of the nation that come out?
Yeah.
Lady Russell quite bores one with her new publications.
Yes.
Today, the characters we're talking about are the ones who just re-entered the book in this chapter, Charles and Mary Musgrove. And I think, as we've said before, one of the great sources of comedy in this book.
And the interesting thing is they're not exaggerated characters. They're not caricatures in any way. They are her attempt at a modern couple who has sort of married for the kind of reasons that people were marrying the sort of obvious person in the neighbourhood.
Yeah. And it's sort of weird that they don't get on and yet they do. They kind of know how they work.
I think for me, this chapter gives me a much better insight as to why they work and why they're still together. Because earlier, there are certainly times when I at least ask myself the question, well, why does he put up with her? But here, and in what we were talking about earlier, it seems clear to me that Charles is clearly more self-aware than Mary is, but it seems to me that he actively enjoys arguing with her, he enjoys teasing her. And it struck me that in this chapter, it's almost like a precursor to those 1930s screwball comedies where the couple spend the entire thing arguing.
Although it's also sort of like a softer, gentler, and maybe closer to equal version of the Mr. and Mrs. Bennet or the Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. Charles is not going to win any great academic awards. So there's a much less intellectual capability difference between him and Mary than there is between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. Yeah. But it is the same sort of thing that he is kind of able to poke fun at her a bit.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree. But I think that the key difference between them and the other two couples you were talking about in the other books is Mr. Palmer and Mr. Bennet are fairly openly contemptuous of their wives.
Yeah.
You don't get that from Charles.
And it also said earlier in the book that she and Charles do rub along quite well together. They're united in agreeing that they want his father to give them more money.
And they certainly want to be in one another's company.
I think she wants to maybe more than he does, but he doesn't object. Immediately after the child has his fall, they're both bonded together in panic and anxiety. But then when it's looking better, he's quite happy to go off to dinner without her. Just like he's quite happy to come to Bath without her. He's quite happy to stay in Lyme without her. But she's not happy with being left behind, and when she says she wants to come, he doesn't have any objection to her coming. He's quite happy for her to come. He just doesn't feel the need for her to come, whereas she feels the need to go.
Yes, indeed.
I don't know how much of that is she wants to be with him and how much she just doesn't want to feel he's off having fun and she's missing out.
Or how much is she going to be left by herself with nobody to whinge to?
Yeah, except the servants.
Yes.
There is also the point you made in one of our much earlier episodes about Mary's childhood and why she is such a hypochondriac, why she's always wanting to be the centre of attention. and you were talking about how the age she was when her mother died.
I think the mother dying then really explains a bit more her dependence on Anne, because I don't think Elizabeth would have been a particularly supportive person. But Anne, what you've got is Anne becoming a teenager, which means she's probably taking on a whole sense of moral responsibility for other people at about the time her mother dies.
We don't know what happened to Mary when their mother died, whether Anne was sent to boarding school and Mary was just considered
left
a bit...
with the nurse, yes, or the housemaids or somebody. Yes, was Mary brought up in her later childhood? Was she with the servants, or was Anne around providing some support? Yes.
Also, it occurs to me in relation to this that the family narrative has been that Elizabeth is the beautiful one.
Yes.
And although no one acknowledges it, there's a kind of tacit acknowledgement that Anne is the clever one.
Yes.
Which leaves Mary as the baby.
Yes.
Yeah. And maybe she has felt sidelined and fancying herself ill and demanding attention. Maybe she even was actually sick as a child and she got attention because she was sick. And that just kind of set up a cycle of, if I'm sick, I get attention.
Yes, indeed. Without wanting to project modern psychological notions too much, it is a well-known thing that children do to get attention, to claim that they're sick.
Yes.
Yeah.
My mind then just started skipping across to what would Charles's approach to Mary have been. A really nice young man like Charles who wants to do the right thing. What his approach is to the girl that everybody says is the right one for him to marry. When you're worrying about Henrietta and the Hayters, you get the impression that there's been a lot of childhood interaction. But Charles has really only known the Elliot girls in that picture you had of the handsome one, the clever one, and the little one.
Yes.
And he is probably almost on an age with the clever one, but she wasn't having him, so he turns to the little one. And there may be a bit of that feeling almost that after all, she is younger, he may feel protective towards her.
One other factor which we haven't talked about is that within these multiple, almost invisible distinctions between parts of the gentry, his marrying Mary is a step up.
It's not like he's married up and it's raised his status. It's just he's playing slightly out of his league.
And so inevitably it raises his status and implicitly it raises the Musgroves' status.
On the other hand, he obviously took it for granted as he was growing up. The Elliot girls who are in the neighbourhood look like the appropriate people for him to choose for marrying. He has got property in his own right. They've only got, there's 3 of them. So they aren't going to be that rich.
It's a step up, but it's not an unrealistic step up.
It's the sort of thing that's happening all the time.
Yeah.
Yes, the Elliots regard Charles as a perfectly acceptable husband for their youngest daughter.
Or even probably for their middle daughter.
Yes, but not for the eldest.
Yes.
Yeah. Just to sum up on Charles and Mary, they're not a delightful married couple like the Crofts, but they're getting on okay.
Yeah.
You have no doubt that they regard themselves as together forever.
Yeah.
That she's no more likely to feel that she could change Charles than she could change her father.
And he's getting on with his life. He's got his wife, he's got his children, he's got his shooting, and he's got his estate that he's going to inherit. It does sort of imply that if he'd married Anne, he might have made more of himself. But he's perfectly content the way he is.
Yes.
He's not doing any harm.
Okay, so for this episode, for the historical section, I'm going to talk about field sports, which are what our North American listeners would call hunting. It's not called hunting in England because by this time hunting is a term used more or less exclusively for fox hunting.
Something you do on top of a horse.
Yes. So field sports were incredibly popular pastimes amongst the landed gentry and aristocracy of Jane Austen's day. And as well as being a leisure activity, they served several practical purposes. They put food on the table, rid estates of nuisance vermin, and were an important social marker. They highlighted the social boundaries between those who had the right to participate and those who didn't. And, not unimportantly, kept gentlemen entertained throughout the autumn and winter. Men of the gentry class indulged in shooting and hunting with such enthusiasm that, if we look at period letters, their wives frequently complained to one another of being stuck with them in the country during the season and not seeing them from the beginning of the day to the end, rather like Mary in the book. So there are three broad categories of field sports. The first is shooting, which I'm going to talk primarily about. And shooting is the killing of birds, hares and rabbits with shotguns, sometimes, in fact, more usually called fowling pieces in period, while using gun dogs to locate, flush and retrieve the game. Shooting birds was also called fowling, hence the alternative name of the weapon. Hunting, as I've already mentioned, is the killing of foxes, stags and other animals by setting scent hounds on them. In the case of foxes, this is done on horseback. Hunting rabbits with young beagles was done on foot and called beagling. Fox hunting is an enormous topic in and of itself, and given that it's not really relevant to Persuasion, I'm not going to discuss it today. The third is deer stalking, which is the killing of deer with rifled muskets, usually accompanied by a single dog to point the game. However, by the Regency, deer stalking was largely confined to Scotland and therefore was something only done by the wealthiest in society. So again, I won't be talking about that in any detail today. So the first thing to say is that the right to shoot was a fiercely protected privilege, limited to those who owned land worth £100 a year or those who rented lands worth £150 a year, the eldest sons of squires or persons of high degree, as well as the owners of franchises. It was illegal to own shooting or hunting dogs unless one was legally qualified to participate in field sports.
This would have been largely controlled by the justices of the peace, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I mean, somebody in a village who owned a pet foxhound would be reported to the local magistrates.
Yes, indeed. So this statute saying that they aren't allowed to own dogs is really important. It is, comparatively speaking, quite difficult to prosecute someone for poaching because they have to be caught in the act with game that they're not allowed to shoot on them, which makes it difficult. Whereas if you can just turn up to where they live and look at their dogs and say, that's a hunting dog, you're nicked, sunshine, it's much easier. So these prohibitions restricted shooting to the landed gentry and aristocracy. One grey area is around friends they invited, who, according to the letter of the law, would themselves have to meet the qualifications. But I think this is something that there is little or no evidence that anyone was prosecuted for that.
So from the point of view of Persuasion, what this means is Charles Musgrove had the right because he was the son of a squire.
Yes.
And he invited Captain Wentworth to shoot with him, which may have technically not been allowed, but was social custom and everyone did it.
Yes, indeed. So whilst Captain Wentworth has the wealth to be recognised as a gentleman, but does not own or lease land, so technically it is illegal for him to hunt, but no one would prosecute him. So if you were leasing property, you did need from the owner what's called a deputation that made it clear that part of your rental agreement included the right to shoot. This is the deputation that Admiral Croft inquires about when he leases Kellynch Hall. Harriet and Ellen talked about this in an earlier episode, and they also commented on the fact that Admiral Croft is described as that he likes to carry a gun, but he never kills. And whilst I agree with the comments they made at the time, I did want to make one other point, and that is the social significance of him carrying a gun. It is a visible sign to all who see him of his status as the incumbent lord of the manor. So that is another important reason why it would seem less odd to Austen's readers than it would to us that one could say of someone that they carry a gun but they never shoot.
Yes.
The other thing worth mentioning, those legally qualified to hunt the gentry and above could also hunt game on their tenants' lands with virtual impunity. Equally, owners of small plots could not shoot or snare the game that nested in their hedgerows, even if they were destroying their crops. The one exception to this were rabbits, which could be killed by the occupiers of land, but that same statute also says that they are not allowed to kill the, quote, more destructive hares. Only those entitled few mentioned above could hunt hares. So, with some exceptions, again, most notably rabbits, shooters were not permitted to sell game. It could, however, and frequently was, be given away. Game could be sent to anyone the shooter wanted, as long as money didn't change hands. So, one example from Jane Austen's work of discussing this would be where John Dashwood, having persuaded himself that he doesn't need to give them money, does claim that he would send them the occasional gift of game. So to make clear, that would cost him literally nothing. Yeah. Even so, I suspect that any game that appeared on the Dashwood ladies' table would have come from Sir John and not from him. So all the evidence in Persuasion suggests that the shooting described in the novel is carried out in the more traditional way of a small party, including some servants to reload, carry the game and look after the dogs, walking out to a covert or wood using dogs, pointers and setters to locate any game birds or other small game like rabbits or hares in the area, flushing them out with spaniels, shooting the game, sending retrievers out to bring them in, and then walking on to the next location.
Did you have to have dogs that could perform the two functions of pointing and bringing it back?
Well, technically, there are 3 jobs that dogs can do. There are those that show you where the game is, pointers, which stand and point with their nose, and setters who do the same job, but by approaching and then sitting. There are dogs that are used to flush the game. At this period, that's more for rabbits and hares than for birds. And then there are the retrievers who go out and pick up the
and these would be different dogs.
Some dogs could be trained for multiple roles.
Yeah.
At this stage, it's less codified than it would be in the later 19th century. So, again, to go to Sense and Sensibility, Willoughby goes out with 2 pointers. Yes. He doesn't go out with 2 pointers and a retriever.
And it's probably worth noting that some time ago, the podcast The Thing About Austen did a special episode on Willoughby's pointers, where they had as their guest a woman who specialises in animals in the long 18th century. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes because it was very interesting.
At this stage, it was pretty much still the norm to shoot birds on the ground, whereas later into the 19th and into the 20th century that becomes taboo, hence the term sitting duck. I would point out one reason for this is that if one is shooting, as everyone was in this period, with a flintlock, shooting a bird in the air is much more difficult than it is with a more modern percussion cap. When one shoots with a flintlock, there is a distinct pause between the hammer striking. The powder then needs to burn down into the barrel before it fires. So there is a distinct pull the trigger, 1,000, 2,000, bang.
Yes.
So the kind of shooting of pheasants and other game birds that people think of today is pretty much an anachronism in the context of Jane Austen's novels. So whilst that new French style of shooting, as it was known, the battue, in which the shooters remain in a set location while a line of men or boys called beaters struck at the ground cover to drive out the birds and encourage them over the shooters for them to shoot, had already been introduced to England by Robert Coke in 1796. But since this required a much larger entourage of beaters and other servants and was much more expensive, and that form of shooting is more difficult with a flintlock, this didn't really become the norm in Britain until the Victorian period, when the kind of industrialisation of shooting really takes over, where game birds are essentially farmed on large estates in preparation for the shooting season. That's not as yet the kind of shooting that members of the level of the gentry class that Jane Austen writes about would have been engaging in. There is mention of shooting seasons in Jane Austen. They did exist at this time, though I suspect they're rather the less formalised than again they become in the Victorian period. There is not one start of the hunting season. There are different seasons for different species of bird. The most famous one is, of course, the so-called Glorious 12th, which is the 12th of August, which is the beginning of the red grouse season. By contrast, the partridge season started on the 1st of October. All bird shooting seasons were over by the end of February, and it was illegal to shoot or hunt on Sunday, on Christmas Day, or at night.
Can I query that? The thing I found, and this is the current year's dates, they all finish on January 31st, and it's February in Persuasion we're at the moment, and the shooting is over for Charles. So are you sure it's end of February or start of February?
So the sources I have looked at, which are looking at it in a Regency context, are saying the end of February. But there are different seasons for different birds, and not all birds are going to be native and available to shoot in every part of the country. So it may well be that there is still shooting going on in, I don't know, northern Yorkshire of other species that are not available down in southern England where the book is taking place.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which does fall broadly into the category of field sports, is rat hunting, which represents the less salubrious side of Regency field sports, or perhaps more accurately, blood sports, since this does in fact make an appearance in chapter 22, where Charles Musgrove enthusiastically describes how he and Captain Benwick had a famous set-to at rat hunting in my father's great barns, where Captain Benwick played his part so well that I have liked him the better ever since. Rat hunting or ratting involved sending small dogs, the ancestors of many modern terriers and indeed dachshunds, down holes and into crevices to drive the rats out, where they would then be either killed by larger dogs or clubbed to death by the waiting hunters. I know that many readers might be quite taken aback at the idea of the poetry-loving Captain Benwick being an enthusiastic participant in this kind of rodent bloodbath. However, Jane Austen would have known from her brothers that this was a skill that every Royal Naval officer would have acquired as a midshipman. Every Royal Naval ship was infested with rats, and midshipmen were not only responsible for exterminating them, but in fact this was considered a highly prized perk of their position. On a long ocean voyage, supplies of fresh meat inevitably ran out, and so rats, under the euphemistic name of millers, became a highly sought-after source of fresh meat that the midshipmen could either eat themselves or sell to their crewmates. Indeed, a number of contemporary officers' journals note how the price of millers would rise over the course of a voyage as a shrinking supply of rodents were the only alternative to salt pork, which sometimes had gone around the world several times before they were required to eat it. Make of that what you will.
Up until now, I've been talking about screen adaptations, both nominally faithful and modernised. For this episode, I'm going to be talking about books that retell the story of Persuasion in its time period, but from the point of view of a different character.
Right.
Now, you remember when we did Emma, I had 4 of them. There was Mr. Knightley's Diary. There was a book called Jane Fairfax. There'd been several, but I just talked about one of them. There was Diana Birchall's great story, In Defence of Mrs. Elton. And then there was another one called Mrs. Goddard, Mistress of a School. For Persuasion, I had a lot more difficulty finding books written from another perspective. So I've only got 2 to talk about. One of them is Captain Wentworth's Diary by Amanda Grange. Now, she's the one who's done a whole series. Yeah, Mr. Darcy's Diary, Edmund Bertram's Diary, etc., etc. What she does with her books is she tries to stay as faithful as she possibly can to the story and just fill in some of the gaps or give the perspective of the male character. Occasionally she branches out. You may remember that when I talked about Mr. Knightley's Diary, I said she actually created a nice little background romance for Miss Bates. Oh. But in general, she keeps to the story as written and she tries to keep the characters as written. I haven't really got a lot to say about this book. One of the things I did like about it, though, is it starts in the year 6. So she makes up the whole original relationship between Wentworth and Anne. I don't always like the way she presents the romance developing, but what I really did like in her presentation is she really caught this picture of someone who is spending freely what has come freely. You know, he decides to buy a horse and his brother says, well, what are you going to do with a horse when you're back at sea? And I think he buys new clothes. He's just spending a lot of money, which so fits with that line that Jane Austen gave us.
Yes. It's particularly what Lady Russell's been noticing.
Yes.
That's very shades of Patrick O'Brien too.
That this is what sailors did. That they...
Yes, particularly young naval officers for the first time they have money and they spend it.
Yeah. I won't really go into details of the rest of it because all it really does is, well, that's dismissive. She's obviously put a lot of work into it and she does just tell you the story from Wentworth's point of view, so you get his bitterness and anger and then you get it sort of gradually unfolding and turning into his love for Anne. And I enjoyed reading it. As with all of her books, it's very competently done. I didn't feel in any way it jarred with what we have in the book. But one thing that did strike me is the end section of it. So she has his diary entries going through to March. And as we know, on the 1st of March, Napoleon landed on the French mainland. On the 13th, the Congress of Vienna declared him outlaw, and on the 17th, Britain pledged to put men into the field. And she has diary entries on sort of the 13th of March, the 15th of March, the 17th of March, and they're all about that Mr. Elliot has disappeared and Wentworth and Anne are looking for a house and that sort of thing, but it doesn't mention those world events, which I found slightly concerning oversight.
And they're not a long way away where they wouldn't have got the news.
No.
So at the point where they are rearming, he is going to be getting orders from the Admiralty to say that he needs to report to one of the naval ports or dockyards. So a large part of the fleet had been mothballed, put in ordinary, as they said at the time. And then when Napoleon escapes, they have to call them all back. That's what he'd have been doing at that point.
The very last diary entry is Friday the 9th of June, where he says, today Anne and I were married. And yeah, it's a lovely diary entry. It's a great finish to the book. But the 9th of June is only 9 days before the 18th of June, which is the Battle of Waterloo. I cannot believe this diary entry of Friday 9th of June fits with only 9 days before the Battle of Waterloo. Honestly, that's the only thing I found really disappointing about this book. The fact she had it finishing in the 100 days and there was no mention of it.
Yes.
There was one other book I found that was also from the point of view of Captain Wentworth, but I thought it would kind of be overkill to read and talk about 2 Captain Wentworth perspectives. But the other one I found, fortuitously in the library of the Jane Austen Society of Australia, is called Mrs. Clay, The Austen Expert's Companion to Persuasion by Dorothea Sophia Rossellini, who's an Australian author. She has a very arch way of writing. Yes. And she assumes that the reader of this book has read Persuasion. Persuasion exists as an artefact. So she often will specifically talk about what Jane Austen has said or done in Persuasion. For example, she says, It is understandable that Austen does not even attempt to record the first meeting between Elizabeth, Sir Walter, and the middle-aged young Mr. Elliot, which of course we talked about in an earlier episode. How would that first meeting have gone? So she gives us that, but she specifically says in this kind of arch way that Jane Austen didn't give us this, so I'm going to. She assumes the reader has read Persuasion. In fact, at one point she even says, if you haven't read Persuasion, go away and do it now and then come back. I didn't particularly take in a lot of it to her style of writing, but I thought that's personal taste, and I did think it was kind of interesting that she chose that way to do it.
Yes.
Sometimes, as in the case of Amanda Grange, this sort of book is designed to give you a different perspective, but you're still meant to like the hero and the heroine.
Yes.
But some books do actively try to present characters we have come to think of as the characters we like into characters we don't like. I mean, I kind of feel it shouldn't be a zero-sum game. If you want to write a book that says Mrs. Elton actually has some good points,
Yes.
surely you can do it without saying, and therefore there's all this extra stuff you shouldn't like about Emma. In defense of Mrs. Elton, Diana Burchell is giving us Mrs. Elton's point of view and making an unsympathetic character sympathetic, but she's not in any way trying to change our views on Emma or Mr. Knightley. Other people want to make you dislike the main characters, and I don't enjoy those books.
Yes.
This one, Mrs. Clay, was kind of like that, in that the presentation of Anne was not all that well realised, but she basically is setting Anne up as being a bit smug and superior and not likeable.
Yes.
And even more, she's doing that with Wentworth. What she does is she basically says, particularly before he met Anne, he was the kind of sailor who drank, who showered prize money on ladies, who contracted STDs, and then Persuasion started, and then he was posted to the Asp and the Laconia, and he became much more moral and upright. As I said, I don't like books that say the hero and the heroine are not nice people. It's a personal thing, but I don't like it. Now, as far as I can tell, she's generally pretty good on the history. Other than one reference to Lady Russell's husband being Sir Russell, that might have been an intentional mistake. Everything she says about the Navy fitted with what Michael has said about the Navy. Now, it gives Mrs. Clay a backstory that isn't really consistent with the book, so I think it's just something she was interested in and wanted to write about, in that Mr. Shepherd was originally a spy and arranger of English-French legal matters, and in fact spent some time in the Bastille during the Revolution. And Mrs. Clay's backstory, the complete inverse of Anne's, because her husband was Commander Clay. Her friend tried to persuade her not to marry him, or at least to wait a bit and see what happened, but she insisted on marrying him, like Fanny Price's mother. And so that went badly.
That seems to me a reason for writing it, for putting spies into it seems silly.
Yeah. And in fact, Mrs. Clay's two children are not her children, they are her niece and nephew. Because one key part of the plot is that Mr. Elliot believes Mrs. Clay to be barren, and so he, at certain points, is actually thinking she should marry Sir Walter because that will stop Sir Walter from siring any more children. One thing I did quite like is that it says when Sir Walter was quite a young child, his father had the measure of the kind of person he was and sat down with his lawyer and says, a new will, tie up the whole estate tight as the law allows and entail it heirs male for as long as my will can reach. Because he basically can see that otherwise Sir Walter is just going to fritter everything away. So I'm not going to go through in detail about what happens in the book, but I just wanted to pick up a couple of things that we've commented on that this book particularly addresses.
Yes.
One was that in Persuasion, Mr. Elliot doesn't appear to be in the least concerned about the fact that Mrs. Smith is in town and Anne is seeing her, and Mrs. Smith is going to be bitter about him. In this book, he has in fact worked that out, and Mrs. Clay has briefly become infatuated with Mr. Elliot, and he convinces her to go and steal the box of letters so that Mrs. Smith will have no evidence. And then, for reasons, they go back. But that's one of the sort of slight gaps in the plot that she addresses.
Yes.
Now, because of that, he then moves on to blackmailing Mrs. Clay, and so she actually gives us what happens in that scene where Mary has seen them through the window, Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot talking to each other. just, again, one of those gaps in the novel that we commented on in this episode that she's addressed. And the third thing we briefly commented on in this episode that she actually diverts to do is to consider what would have happened if Anne had told Lady Russell before she'd got back together with Wentworth. And she spends a couple of pages just spinning a little scenario about how, in fact, it probably wouldn't have been a happy ending for anyone. But it more or less follows the plot up to Anne and Wentworth getting engaged, but pretty much ignores the final chapter of Persuasion.
Right.
And writes its own ending. Instead of Mr. Elliot running away with Mrs. Clay, she then spins off into a whole alternate ending where Mr. Elliot, having lost Anne, marries Elizabeth, Anne marries Wentworth, and ultimately Mrs. Clay manages not just to marry Sir Walter, but to have children and thus disinherit Mr. Elliot and Elizabeth. So that's how it all winds up. It does make an interesting contrast with Captain Wentworth's diary, which tries to be very, very faithful to the book. As I said, I didn't really care for the arch style of writing, but that was personal preference. I didn't really care for the revolutionary spies thing. It's a sensationalist backstory for Mrs. Clay that doesn't fit with the style of Jane Austen in general or Persuasion in particular. But I did think there were some amusing aspects of it. I don't think I'd ever particularly want to reread this one, but I found it an interesting experience. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
Me, Michael.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be finishing up Persuasion with chapters 23 and 24.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com.
We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.